My name is Elz, and I'm a vegan and animal rights activist, but I'm also a consultant, and I work in the issues of gender equality and women's empowerment, and I give advice to organizations on issues like inclusion, how to be inclusive towards women and men and other people. So this is a little bit of my background and why I'm doing this kind of workshops. And I have a co-facilitator here who is Aisha, and she can also maybe briefly tell something about herself before we get to the agenda and introduction of everyone here.
Sure, thank you so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Aisha Denise. You can choose one of the names, it's totally up to you. I'm also a vegan animal rights activist, and I work on intersectionality for quite some time now. And yeah, I do actually diversity for SAVE movement in particular, which involves training people, recruiting people, making sure that the culture is inclusive and that everybody is on the same page. And I'm like really happy to co-facilitate and help Elz with questions and so on. So I'll be following the chat. Yeah, nice to be here. Thanks.
Great, thank you. All right, so this workshop is gonna be broadly on the topic of how to be inclusive as animal rights activist or as an animal rights movement, and zoom in mostly on intersectionality. And the reason is also because we hear it a lot and also people use this term a lot. But I also understand that for a lot of people it's new and you might not know where it comes from or what the history is. So we're just going to give a little bit of introduction about this term and how it is used, and then discuss some issues in the animal rights movement. So how has intersectionality been used, or how can you use an intersectional framework to look at animal rights issues? And we'll discuss tactics and messages also using this framework. So that is the agenda. Anytime you have a question or don't understand something, that's very fine. Please yeah, use the X or something. Yeah, there are also some other kind of safe space rules or things how we can organize ourselves together is I hope to create an atmosphere of privacy and trust. Now I know that's quite difficult when you just said the meeting is going to be recorded. Within those limitations or possibilities, I hope everyone feels free to express themselves, and also that we don't take things that people have said out of this meeting and you know, like say things to others about, well, Elz said these kind of things and etc. So please have some respect for each other's privacy. Also respect each other's contributions and questions. Like, everyone is learning. This is a university where everyone is learning, including the speakers, the facilitators. No one is perfect here. Another one is step up and step down, which basically means that if you feel that you talk too much, you might want to step down a little bit and stop talking too much. And if you feel like you haven't really said so much, please feel free to step up and talk. But yeah, it's no obligation. Well, there's no tolerance really for discrimination or aggressive behavior and language, which means that if something like that happens, we might give you some kind of warning, but then if that continues, you can be thrown out of this space. If there's any kind of problems or conflicts you have, you can talk directly to me or the co-facilitator. So that's Aisha Denise. And those were my kind of rules or idea of how to create a space that is safe and a good place for everyone to learn. Is there anyone who wants to add something to this or maybe take something away? All right, then, yes, let's do a little introduction. So what I would like to know from everyone, who are you? So tell something about yourself, but keep it short because we also don't want to spend too much time on introduction. So your name, and you can choose whatever name you like. Your pronouns, so how do you want to be addressed, and just one identity that you have. And you can choose whatever you like, but I would advise you not to use the identity of a vegan or an activist, because I think a lot of us are vegan activists, but choose something, for example, from this picture, like your gender, your age, or something else, and then share it with other people. So I will start. In my case, my name is Elz, my pronouns are she, her, and about my identity, I identify as poly. So that means I'm not non-monogamous in an ethical way. And I give the floor to Aisha.
Thank you. My name is Aisha, or Denise. I use the she, her pronoun, although I'm somewhat undecided about that. In terms of identity, it's so hard for me to choose an identity because I don't know, like I can say maybe immigrant, but I don't feel like one. I can say Turkish, I don't really feel like one. I could say woman, I don't really feel like one. So I'll just choose straight. Should I choose the next person?
Yes, please. All right, so I asked you to just choose one of these identities, and this is also like one of the reasons why I do this at the beginning is that we have multiple identities, right? So when I ask you to choose one, it's actually very difficult for a lot of people, including for myself, because we are not singular people with just one identity, but sometimes like society, of course, makes you maybe feel that one identity is more important than others. So it's just by way of introduction. And why the pronouns? That's like, I like to use pronouns as an introduction to meetings because one, it just helps people to avoid assuming that because of the looks of someone, they use a certain pronoun. It just makes sure that we actually know what pronoun someone goes by, and we use the correct pronoun. So in that way, it's a form of respect and being more inclusive. And also being aware of your privilege when you have, like myself, for example, using the pronouns she, her. The majority of people use these pronouns, and quite often we are not really aware what kind of privilege this is. Like, I have, not that I remember, I don't think I've ever been misgendered. And that is a huge privilege, I think. So it's something sometimes to be aware of. You might have sometimes seen people using these kind of buttons or pins that actually, the ones that are here in the slide. And also sometimes in workshops, people write their pronoun on their, when they have a name tag or something. And I found out actually also in Zoom and online meetings, you can change your name and you can also put your pronoun there. So I thought that was quite a nice feature that we can use or not. All right, so let's talk a little bit about identity. So we all have identities and we all have multiple identities. And these are just a few because it's kind of an endless range of identities. And I would say every identity is a social construct. So that's, for example, when we look at gender, that's really something that society, that culture creates. And it's something that changes over time. So this is also how you can see it's a social construct. And it's also different wherever you go. So, for example, the idea of what a woman is and how a woman should behave is completely different here in the Netherlands in this century from somewhere in Zimbabwe in the 16th century, for example. So, so the idea of what a certain identity is or how someone should perform, that is all social, that is all changeable, but also the whole idea about those identities generally. And somehow we sometimes tend to think that a lot of these identities are actually kind of biological, or they can't change, or it's just the way it is. Well, this is kind of something that society tries to pushes us in this way of thinking, but it's actually not really the case. Another thing about identity, it's interesting that our identities are on one hand something unique. So I have an identity that is composed out of these multiple identities where I feel that I belong. So it gives me like a unique perspective or a unique position, but also my identity makes sure that I belong to a certain group. So I belong to people who are cisgender, for example. So there's like these two different things that are quite interesting when you look at identity. Another thing is that identities are kind of related to binary thinking, where we normally think of, for example, heterosexual, homosexual, men, women. And in fact, these the realities for people is that it's more a spectrum, so it's more fluid. And something very, very important, that identities are always linked to power and privilege. So in this binary thinking, normally we create, there's an identity that is the mainstream, or the identity which has most power. So for example, in our society, this is men, this is people who are white, and all the others who are kind of marginalized identities. And what is another interesting thing is that the norm, so the powerful identity, is usually kind of invisible. So for example, when we talk about whiteness, that is something that a lot of white people, they don't even think about their identity as a white person, because that is kind of considered the norm, what is normal and normative. So that's a lot of theory stuff. I'm actually going to continue with some theory. If anyone has some kind of question, please just raise your hand with the X. Kimberlé Crenshaw. So talking about intersectionality, I hope some of you have actually watched also the video that I posted in this event from Brenda Sanders. So she explains what intersectionality is, and also what it is for the animal rights movement. And she also explains first how Kimberlé Crenshaw has, what her original thoughts were about this this idea or this theory. And I think when we talk about intersectionality, we should always talk about where it came from, or the origins of the term. So Kimberlé Crenshaw actually is the person who first used the term intersectionality. She wrote an article in 1989, so quite some time ago, which is called Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex. And important to realize is that she is a lawyer and also an activist, but she used intersectionality when she was actually doing a study into legal cases on discrimination. So this was discrimination on in the labor market, and where actually what she came up with is that when we talk about discrimination, we talk, for example, about gender discrimination or race discrimination as if it is a separate form of discrimination, and one excludes the other. So in her example, she came with Black women who are discriminated in their work, and they couldn't get the recognition for that because they were told, like, well, the fact that you are fired has nothing to do with your race because we do employ Black people here. But the Black people that were employed were Black men. So in this case, Black women are actually kind of lost out of sight. What she also said, and based on that theory, is that when you have a policy, for example, an anti-discrimination policy that you want to support, for example, women, focusing on one specific issue, you kind of always fail to reach the people within that group that are extra marginalized. So if you have any kind of policy, for example, on emancipation of women, you will kind of automatically have more white, middle-class, middle-aged women, for example, because these people are already belonging to the more dominant group. So intersectionality, in that case, it's a theory that you can use both on for analysis, to how to analyze society as a kind of a lens, but also as a kind of an instrument for people who work on policy level. And that's actually how I have used it a lot. So I see it all the time because I actually work in that area where I develop policies, for example, on how to improve certain services for women, and then you actually really have to do it in an intersectional way. So when you talk about just women, it's usually the women that are already privileged that come up and that make use of such kind of services. And then the last thing that Kimberlé Crenshaw also came up with, well, she came up with a lot of things, but something that I want to share is what she called political intersectionality. And this is basically what happens if, well, in this case, again, because she talked mostly about Black women. So when Black women are, for example, in a group of feminists, so a women's group, and they want to talk about the issue of Black women, they are being told by the majority people there to shut up, because they shouldn't bring up the issue of Black women into women's groups, women's organizations. So this is also something that you see a lot happening also in other groups, in other organizations.
Elz,
yes.
Sorry for interrupting. We have a question from Malek, who's asking if you could maybe sum up the video by Sanders.
Sum up the whole video. Yeah. I have made a summary somewhere. So what she does in this video, I don't know if you watched it, Malek, because it's a bit of a long video. It's like 40 minutes, but there's in the center, there's like the core of, I think, what is in this video. So what Brenda Sanders explains what intersectionality is. She explains why it is important. And she also comes at the end, she comes with a lot of examples of how to be an ally to other movements. And she talks about this from a perspective as being a Black woman herself, being a vegan, and also being in the animal rights movement. So she uses this framework also to look to critically analyze the animal rights movement. And I'm actually going to use a quote from her later. But I think she explains it quite well and very convincing. So please watch it if you haven't done it yet. Are there more questions?
Not for now.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and also what intersectionality is not. So it is an analytical framework, like a lens that you can use to analyze, for example, how racism and sexism works together. And this is also how it was originally intended, but it's not an ideology. right? So sometimes people think it's an ideology, or they say it's a belief, whatever. It is an academic framework for analysis, and it's a theory, basically. It's also a starting point. So it's one way that it's one theory that we can use to look at reality, but it's definitely not the only one. If you listen to F. Coe, for example, she is quite vocal about it. She's just like, well, if you discovered intersectionality is great, but then move on and use other frameworks. Another thing is, I don't think people can be intersectionals, and that is something that we hear a lot from the so-called anti-intersectionals. So they talk about those intersectionals, and I'm like, what is that? Like, it's a kind of a weird thing to me. People, especially in the animal rights movement, now use more often pro-intersectional. And that's also because we are kind of stealing this concept and then using it in a completely different way. So there's more reasons to that, but also, yeah, I don't think you can be an intersectional. It's never been like I think you call it a noun. Or and lastly, intersectionality is one specific framework. And it's part of the larger idea that all oppressions are connected, and that therefore also all liberations are connected. So when we talk about animal liberation, we should talk about total liberation or collective liberation. So intersectionality is one of the ways of looking at this topic. And there's many other different ways. And then also intersectionality as a term is new. It came up in what I said in the late 90s. But it's not the way of thinking that there's all these different kind of oppressions and they are related. That's not new. That's super, super old. So all oppressions matter, and there's no hierarchy of oppressions.
Gemma says, can I make a quick point to build on the super important point?
Yes.
Sorry, I used point twice, so I'm not sure why I did that. Yeah, sorry, very quickly, just because I think what you just said there for me is really the kind of fulcrum of the issue. And I am, like probably most of us, extraordinarily frustrated by, you know, this backlash against an obvious framework concept, as you said, within our movement. So I think it's really important for everybody who has the you know, intelligence and good grace to accept the reality that intersectionality is just what the world is. It's not a belief, it's not an ideology, it's just what happens. That we're all actors, well, you know, activists, basically, to try to help people understand this and to deconstruct whatever resistance there may be. Because I think that the so-called anti-intersectional movement is serving a purpose for certain people and certain ideas, which is not a helpful purpose for animals or for human animals either, for that matter. And it just occurred to me that, like, on social media, if people hear this kind of comment, like, you know, shouldn't be an intersectional, or intersectionality doesn't help, probably a really simple visual metaphor, like, you know, you take coffee and water, you mix it like coffee beans and water, you mix them, you get a cup of coffee. You get a different amount or quantity of coffee granules, different amount of water, you get a different type of coffee, but you get coffee. So it's as futile to kind of deny intersectionality as it is to deny coffee granules and coffee, make a nice cup of coffee, you know, that kind of thing. Because yeah, sorry to intervene, it's just like, because I get so frustrated about this whole backlash against intersectionality. It's a total nonsense. Just wanted to add my voice. Thank you.
No, thanks for the intervention, because I really like it when other people also add to this. So I'm not the only one talking about it, and especially when you know, you feel also maybe these kind of frustrations or whatever, please add to this. So if anyone else has something to say about it, feel welcome. All right, and then the last one about oppression, because I also think that it's also not always clear, and of course there's whole books written about oppression, so this is just one slide. Basically, oppression is all the different types of isms, so racism, sexism, ableism, speciesism, that become systemic. So when you have discrimination, for example, but when it is actually supported by the state and all the institutions, then it becomes oppression. And oppression works all the way from the culture, our norms, belief system, up to how we internalize it in ourselves. So this is very, very wide and broad and throughout our whole society. And this cartoon comes from the vegan feminist network. But I can send you the link later, where it's really nicely explained what is the difference between prejudice, discrimination, and oppression. But it's also clearly shows that they both reinforce each other. So it starts with having individually, you have a certain prejudice about someone. Then when you act out, when you do something that could be, that you can call discrimination. And then when it is supported by the state and all these systems, then it's oppression. So together they strengthen each other. And diversity policy. So we hear a lot about diversity, and then I found this drawing that I thought was quite typical of how a lot of people and organizations, how they look at diversity. So at first it may look kind of nice, like, oh, we're all together and we become a different, group of different kind of people, and everyone can be different. But what you see here is that the people who are already on top, they are actually the ones that decide what the agenda is, and they decide what diversity looks like. So also when we talk about issues like diversity or inclusion, we really have to be careful that quite often we are talking from existing organizations, for example, and they have already set the agenda. They've already decided how the organization looks like, for example. So if you really want to be inclusive, you have to be much more radical and actually use something that I call transformative inclusion. So really go beyond just including people in your spaces and in what you are doing and what you think is right, but really criticize the space itself. So it basically means criticize yourself and all you've been doing before, and make sure that everything can transform. So this is where things get really, really complicated, because not so many people know how to do this, I guess. And then Brenda Sanders, yes.
Before we move on, we have an interesting question from Glenn. He says, so there's a difference between saying I'm against oppression and I'm against all forms of oppression. Is that last one actually incorrect?
I think you can say both. Like, you can probably say I'm against oppression, and you can say I'm against all forms of oppression. But when you say I'm against all forms of oppression, it means, to me, what I hear is that that you actually say there's no hierarchy for you. So it means that for you, all the oppressions are bad. So speciesism is bad, sexism is bad. So for me, that's the difference. But someone else has a different perspective.
I guess ideally saying that I'm against oppression should automatically mean that you're against all forms of oppression.
Yeah. Well, it is a good link to the next slide. So Brenda Sanders, that's the video that I put in the to watch list. So this is a quote from her. She says, activists that are for the animals try to silence the activists who bring up conversations about human oppression, saying the animals are the most oppressed group on the planet, or humans can speak for themselves. So if you remember when I was talking about Kimberlé Crenshaw, this is what she called political intersectionality. Is there anyone who is familiar with this? Have you heard this people saying, like within, now we're talking about the animal rights movement, so have you heard people saying these kind of things?
That they're against?
This, this issue of activists trying to silence people, that they should just talk about animals, or, you know, like these kind of things, like animals are the most oppressed group on the planet. So this is what I call single issue activism.
Yes, every day.
Yeah, every day, yeah. Is there anyone else who wants to say something?
Yeah, I would. If I'm not sure how to indicate that I want to speak. Actually, is it a cross in the chat bar, or?
Yeah, an X. Yeah.
Okay. I think Malik wanted to say something in that case, because there's a star under his name right now. No. Yeah.
So yeah, I think now it's a big topic with like animal rights activists saying that we should only focus on animals, and if you believe in intersectionality, then you're somehow not helping the animals by that, and which I think is quite absurd for me. Yeah. Especially as a person of color and a queer person who has been discriminated against in the past.
Thanks. Gemma? Gemma, sorry.
That's okay, either's fine. Yeah, no, so definitely second what Malika said, that I think it's really a pernicious problem, but I also wanted to add that as well as the idea of silencing intersectionality, or let's say then the recognition that all oppression is, you know, different faces of the same root cause, then, and therefore that we somehow shouldn't be talking about anything outside of animal exploitation, then I think that another form of oppression that happens in a similar vein is actually, I want to call it more like an ontological oppression. And what I mean by that is that not only in some groups, some single issue, you know, that we won't mention, but we all know kind of thing in particular, not only are we only supposed to talk about the animals, but the way that we talk about the animals, the specific conception of what animal exploitation is and how that functions and where it comes from and how it should be addressed. That's also specific very often to the cultural and, you know, the kind of cultural, ethnic, socioeconomic group that tends to dominate in those kinds of organizations. So that's what I mean by ontological. The very nature of what animal exploitation is different for different cultures, different age groups very often, different socioeconomic groups. And those voices are really important, and the meaning and the sense and the authenticity of recounting these different perspectives is really important to help convert other people to veganism and against animal exploitation, but also to find new solutions. So it's both a material exclusion, if you like, but also this kind of like ontological or idea exclusion. And I think both are really pernicious right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I wanted to add that just on a personal experience, I feel like those who say that human oppression doesn't matter and intersectionality doesn't make sense. Personally, I think there's a pattern that intersectionality is misunderstood. I've rarely seen someone who truly understands intersectionality, where it comes from, what it actually advocates for, and that they then argue against that. I think that's rather rare. And I'd like to read Glenn's comment. A question which can be answered later. I hear people saying vegan intersectionals are hypocritical because they allow meat eaters in feminist movements, but no right-wing supporter in the AR movement. What would be an answer to that?
Yeah, I get that as well. So I think for me, if I just speak for myself, I don't even think it is true, because when I'm active in other movements, I also speak about animals, for example. But there's a difference, I think, in, you know, like speaking for animals, or, you know, like not allowing meat, because in this case, for example, it's about allowing meat eaters into, for example, maybe I'm in an anti-racist movement or something, and these people eat meat. Should I even work with them? So to me, there's an important difference that also makes a difference between speciesism and, for example, racism, is that speciesism is completely normalized in our society. There's not even a legal framework that prohibits people to eat animals, for example. So it's also at a different level, but yeah, so that is one answer, but yeah, maybe someone else has something to add to this.
Ollie?
Yeah, also to that point, I think an important difference is like safe spaces. So if you have sexist or racist in the animal rights movement, it kind of disrupts the safe space for people of color or women in the movement. Whereas if you have species in the women rights movement, for example, like non-human animals are not members of that movement. So this issue doesn't exist there.
I didn't hear everything you said, Ollie, but yeah, it said my connection was unstable, but I think I heard most of it. Anyone else who wants to say something about this?
Maybe a last comment from my side just about this, and I know it's kind of it's a difficult topic in itself, but I just wanted to highlight that I think in some cases we are also responsible for people being averse or reacting allergic to the word intersectionality. I think in some sense, some of the mistakes that they do, we do as well. Sometimes instead of guiding and educating and reacting compassionately and just like telling people what it actually means, I think sometimes we are really frustrated with how people tend to think. And we are basically in some way making the same mistake of like just creating this conflict instead of conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And also there's a lot of conflict, of course, that is kind of online. So, you know, you get this really violent communication, basically, that you wouldn't even have if you would just sit around a table with someone. So definitely it's also about explaining much more and being really in conversation with other people instead of always in this discussion framework. Yeah. Also another thing that Brenda Sanders said, like doing intersectional activism is not a choice for me, it's my reality. And I think one of us already said that in the introduction, I forgot who, but I think you said it, Aisha, that it's not like intersectionality is a reality. It's not, you know, it's something that we live with, right? So it's also kind of it's I think it's a privilege to say that intersectionality is not relevant, because it's probably shows that you are not affected by all these isms. So I think the next slides I'll have some examples. Yes, so there is a trigger warning. I've tried to be careful, and I didn't by not choosing, you know, like images or words that that hurt people, but there might still be some triggers. So I hope to limit this. So there's a warning for explicit content. First one, this guy, who knows who this is? And this is actually my PowerPoint program that made this cloud over his face. Like, it was quite funny, but I didn't even do it so much on purpose. Does anyone recognize him?
Yes.
I can also see the chat, I think.
Yeah, yes, Gary
Jurovsky, yeah. So does anyone know what is problematic about Gary Jurovsky without, you know, using too many trigger words? Everything. Okay, maybe Glenn, or maybe someone who didn't speak so much, or someone wants to say something about what is the Anna.
I think you said that we should test on prisoners instead of animals. And also he was saying to women who wore fur that he wished they were raped violently.
Yeah.
And more stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely he said it about women wearing fur, and he said more stuff. I think the one on political prisoners or on testing on prisoners was actually from someone else, but I'm not even sure. But I think the fact is that he did say a lot of things that are quite hurtful and sexist, racist, whatever. Is there anyone else who wants to say something about this topic? Because I saw some movement in the chat.
Some people are commenting. For example, Malek says, comparing animal rights to what happened during World War II. Glenn says he violates a lot of human rights with his hate speech.
Yeah. Yeah. And now of course it's problematic that he says these things, and he has never taken them back. So he's never said anywhere that he's sorry about it or something like that. I think the most problematic thing here that he is still being platformed. So there's still quite some organizations that think he's a hero for speaking out for animals or whatever, and that tell people, go watch his speech, whatever. So this is, for me, what makes it really problematic. Not only the fact that he exists and he talks and says these things, but also that animal rights organizations or animal rights activists go and tell other people like, hey, he's a great activist. And they do that also, even quite often actually, knowing what he has said, because of this idea that the animals are first and he's such a great speaker. So, those kind of things. So, yeah, I think we should be very careful with this, and yeah, so there's some reactions, I think.
Glenn says, yesterday I commented on someone's post who shared and worshipped him. She seemed to be not aware of this.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, okay. So people also are not aware of that. So what I would think would be good, and that's also related to what you were just saying, is a lot of people don't know what intersectionality is. A lot of people don't know what Gary Yourofsky is saying. So the first thing I think is educating them. So if people share posts about him, you don't have to go, like being aggressive to them, but first tell them like, hey, do you know what Gary has said about women or Palestinians or whatever, and give them maybe a link to posts that discuss what he has said, so people can find out, because we definitely need to educate each other about this. Any other response?
Malek says that he didn't know a lot of what we said, so he's really thankful for the input. And Glenn says you can link them to Aisha Denise's talk or the next workshop of Elz. And Gemma says, what did he say about the Palestinians?
He said the Palestinians are the most psychotic people, or something like that. Like, I don't even probably have to tell it, but actually it's, if you Google Gary Yourofsky on Palestinians, you will find out what he said.
Just a comment on that, and I'm going to be careful, but I strongly identify with the pro-intersectional approach to any type of activism. I still think Gary Yourofsky is a valuable activist, and I do find some of the things he says most certainly very problematic. I would personally say that this is something that we can say probably about most activists. And just to add, just from personal perspective, I think Gary Yourofsky is a true and very hardcore misanthrope. I think he very sincerely hates humans. It's not like he has periods where he's angry with humanity. I genuinely think he hates humans. And he did make a response video about some of the things that he said and was criticized for. And that was basically his response. He says, I hate all humans, I hate Israelis, I hate Palestinians, I hate heterosexual people, I hate homosexual people, and don't expect any kind of apology from me in that regard. So I think for someone like Gary Yorsky, who also speaks a lot against intersectionality, it's just impossible because he will never give a drop of value to any human life.
Wow. Yeah.
And Glenn posted a link from the Vegan Feminist Network on probably what he said on Palestine, if I'm not mistaken. Gemma asked, where's the value in him as an activist? And
you.
Yes. And Glenn also posted a link about what I assume is about Gary Yorsky's comment on rape.
And I think Gemma's question is for you, Aisha.
This is a long topic. I'm not sure how much time we have, but
yeah, maybe not too long into this. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe like I mentioned before, in the sense of, I think Gary Yorsky speaks a lot, and we have been following his work to a very, very broad extent. And I think if you did that with me, if you did that with other people, if I spoke so publicly and if I lived with my opinions so publicly, I think there will be very serious problems in everyone we find. And personally, from a diversity perspective, I think people like this also have their place in the movement. I think what's more important is that the majority and the general culture is able to carry that kind of view as well. If we have a movement or a world in which the majority of the people think like this, I believe that's a problem. But I hope for our culture and our movement to be strong enough to even give people like that space. That's a summary of how I would think about that. Malek says he moved a lot of people towards veganism. We can't deny that, but he made terrible statements. Well, he retired anyways. Robin says, good faith question. Gary Yorsky is quite well known for comparing animal agriculture to the Holocaust. Would you say these kinds of comparisons are problematic, or is there something to be said for this? And Gemma would like to say something.
Maybe Gemma, you want to also respond to this?
Sure, I'll keep it super quick. Sorry.
But don't talk too fast, please.
So this is because I don't want to take up too much airtime, so I'm conscious I've said a few things already. But it's just to respond to what you said, that I think that the rub, like the kind of insight to this. The reason I want to say this is because I think it's a really important point, basically, that we overlook, that can be overlooked easily, that when people have a huge platform, when they do have a genuine influence, and I put my hand up and admit I went vegan because of Gary Yorsky's video, so bear that in mind before I say what I'm about to say. I really did. I was vegetarian and thought that was good enough, but it's his video that made me vegan overnight. But the reality is, if he's got such a platform and he is influencing so many people, it's not only going to be what he says about animals that he's influencing people with. He's also potentially, very strongly potentially, going to be, I think, influencing them in some of his other views. And I would question, as much as I struggle to maintain any kind of healthy respect or love for humanity sometimes, myself included, I do question when someone is so overtly misanthropic and so ready in the public domain to denigrate and to violate the respect and safety of other humans. I don't think that propagates an ideology that can motivate people to want to save the sentient creatures, which are very often amongst the most vulnerable, which is animals other than humans. I think that it's pernicious. I didn't know this stuff. I only knew him from that one video, and I'm really shocked. But my immediate reaction is, okay, this is not a voice which is helpful. And I think it relates very strongly to the subject of our conference today, because this happens very often when people's voices carry the idea of animal liberation with a very certain ideology in mind, it can undermine itself, because all oppression counts. None are free until all are free. There's nothing true ever said as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, I'll leave it there. It's just, I think that for me, I think now I've heard this, I will never post another video of his again. That's for sure.
Yeah, and I think we should not go too much into detail on this topic, but definitely for everyone who doesn't know so much, like, look it up and make your own decision based on what you believe and what you find important. I'm not gonna tell people what to do. I have my own opinion, and that is more like I think we should not platform people who say things that are racist and sexist, especially not when they know about this and they don't feel any regret or something about it. So, and that's because I think we should not replicate or further continue oppressing ourselves.
I think Glenn wants to also say something.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to answer to Robin's question, comparing the animal agriculture to the Holocaust. Personally, for me, I don't think it's necessary. I think what's happening to the animals is bad enough, and you don't need to compare it to the Holocaust to make your point. The word Holocaust is very triggering for certain people. So if you cannot use it, I would advise not to, because the reality of what's happening is already bad enough. You don't need that word to make your point, basically. And that's what my opinion is about using that word.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's very clearly explained, Glenn. And also, I read today something from Patrice Jones in, I think it was in Sister Vegan book, that she also said like that some people can make their own analogies for their own situation, like comparing what happens to animals to whatever happens to them. But it doesn't mean that you have to make those analogies. So if I'm doing, for example, outreach, and someone themselves says like, oh, that's like, you know, whatever, Holocaust, for example, like that's for that person to say, but I don't think that we as animal rights activists should do that. And the reason is that it is hurtful and unnecessary, as you say. Is there any other comments still?
I believe not.
Okay. Well, the next one is kind of related. So PETA is quite known for its advertisements that look like this, for example. So the upper one, save the whales, lose the blubber, go vegetarian. And then the other one, turn over a new leaf, go vegan. So is there anything wrong with these advertisements? And then what would be wrong with them?
Malek. Mm-hmm.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, again, white, skinny women. So the standard stereotypical pictures that you see on every magazine, which is really bad. Also, their campaign about veganism improving your sexual life and whatnot. I think, okay, they kind of make a point, but reducing or making, let's say, okay, a man who is asexual, for example, and he's like, okay, I don't have sex anyway, so why should I? And I'm not saying that asexual people don't have sex, but I mean, if someone doesn't have that desire and then they're like, oh, then I shouldn't go vegan, I don't know. They're just reinforcing these thoughts that we are already somehow bothered by.
Is there anyone else with a response?
Mariana?
Yeah, this also reminds me of other things that PETA does that I don't really agree with. For example, them having every year the world's sexiest vegan, or, you know, I don't really understand what's the point in there. Well, I understand, but it doesn't make sense to me anymore, also because of these issues. So I don't think they have a right approach when they use people's sexual image and everything to promote this message.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We have a question from Anna, but I think we can wait maybe for a few more comments specifically about this.
yeah, maybe want to say something. I don't think I'm skipping someone, am I? No, should be fine. I think as a man, it's more difficult to comment on this, but when I see this picture, I see, well, I assume the women who are protesting here are doing it voluntary. Well, I hope at least, but I also question, like, how are you gonna use the female body to bring over your message, like using sexism in this case to bring over the animal's message? Like, there's always a thing which like comes across my mind when I see pictures like this.
Is there anyone else with a comment? Or? Right. Yeah, I mean, so this, what Peter does here is basically like fat shaming or body shaming. And I think it's quite clear, especially in the upper cartoon, but also on other levels. You see this a lot in the, especially in the vegan movement or the animal rights movement. So and linked to that, there's a lot of focus on vegans being always healthy and skinny, and you know, that you can just Google vegan healthy and you see all these images, and it really contributes to people who don't have this model, you know, like body, to just not feel welcome in the vegan movement and literally feeling excluded. So for anyone who likes to know more about it, you can Google PETA and sexist advertisements. You find a lot, and there are also some really good animal rights activists who talk about this fat shaming and ableism and all these kind of related forms of discrimination that we see a lot in the vegan movement. And yeah, Glenn, you said, well, these women are probably not forced into doing that. Well, I also think they're probably not forced into doing this. There is, of course, something about like how oppression works. So oppression is both, you know, like systemic, comes from our culture and society, up to where, you know, people internalize oppression and they find it completely normal. So what you see with a lot of women, and that's also why women contribute to sexism, is that we kind of internalize this whole idea of our, you know, our bodies have to be perfect, and we you know, we have a certain relationship to man, etc. So there's a lot more than just the first idea of being forced into doing some kind of action. But yeah, there's different, you know, like there's different things that could be said about this. I don't know if anyone has some other comment. Yes.
Malek says, fat shaming in the animal rights or vegan movement. I heard from vegans that you shouldn't even show that you're sick. We're superhumans who are skinny and are healthy, don't smoke, don't drink, and eat salads.
And smoothies.
Yeah. And Sibel is asking, which year did this campaign happen?
I don't know. Like, I just did some Google search, but I think PETA is still doing this kind of campaigns. They've been doing this for years and they've been criticized, and they continue with it. So it's one of the bigger examples of organizations that use sexism in their campaigns. Yeah.
And I guess before we move to the next topic, just a quick question from Anna. What about the word slave? For example, animals are enslaved by humans.
No. To me, it's the same as the category of the Holocaust comparisons. So there is a lot of, like, for a lot of people, there's a kind of a connotation to these words that are related to their, you know, like their own background, and they feel hurt by it. And you don't have to use these kind of words to make yeah, it's basically what Glenn said. It's not even necessary. You can talk about how animals are kept and how they are kept against their will and they're being exploited, and you don't have to call it Holocaust or slavery when it's not necessary. So that, for me, that makes it that's like a very clear argument. So, and it definitely, aside from is it right or wrong, it definitely pushes people out of the vegan movement, or they feel not welcome or they feel excluded. So that could also be a reason not to use these words.
And about body and fat shaming, Eve is saying, how is this different from the vegan bodybuilding we are promoting now?
Yeah.
Really good point.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's all linked to the same, that this also, if you look at the Game Changers, the movie, we see a lot, like there's also this erection thing with men, and so it's very much focused on these kind of masculinities, and like, again, being in the same kind of framework, like you're a man when you're like this and you're strong and whatever. So I just think we have to be careful with these promoting it. On the other hand, yeah, I mean, vegan diets can be very healthy. So there's some kind of balance that we need to make.
Manik would like to say something, and then Glenn.
Yes, that's the last two comments.
Okay, I don't think promoting healthy vegans is a bad thing if it's in a good context. So let's say, for example, I'm talking to a person who is into sports, and they want to, or they're afraid they're not going to make it on a vegan plant-based diet. Well, that's plant-based, not vegan. Then it's good also to have that support of a movie like the Game Changers or of these bodybuilders, and say, hey, listen, you can do it even on a plant-based diet. So I think it depends on the context.
Yeah, yeah.
And Glenn's question was already covered.
Okay. So I want to continue because otherwise we don't end on time. So I'm not going into this one, but you can look it up if you want, XR and police, and you'll find out what I wanted to discuss. This one we need to discuss because we are Animal Resistance University. So Animal Resistance held an action last year, November, which was focused on foie gras. Occupied a foie gras farm, and then held this how do you call it, like a theater, or did a how do you call this thing, an action in a supermarket. And this is actually what was done and how it was being portrayed and shared in media. And that led to some discussion. So I also wanted to discuss things amongst ourselves. So yeah, these are 3 questions, but probably it's a little bit too much. But I think everyone can see the picture and think for themselves what their opinion is. So do you think this form of action is disturbing? For who might it be disturbing? What forms of oppression do you see? And do you think this is effective and necessary, or are there other forms equally effective to, bring the message? So those are 3 questions, but maybe a few of us can respond to 1 or 2 of those questions.
Gemma?
I do have an opinion, but someone else jump in like as soon as anyone else wants to say anything. It's quite short. So I was there actually, and I sat down with them afterwards, and I stayed, and I got arrested. I remember it was really fun. But aside from that, then I don't know exactly what discussions took place about this event, but I can imagine that one of the oppressions that may be visible is the fact that it was Caroline being force-fed. She inhabits a perceived female body in our society, and it was a perceived man who was doing that. So I guess it's that. However, my opinion on it is actually the other way around, which is that although that does absolutely without any doubt does portray an oppression which is prevalent in our society, male bodies dominating and oppressing female bodies. But on the other hand, my other hat in life is I work as a communications consultant, and with that hat on, what I see is that using that optic, portraying, it's basically an analogy, right? We're developing a visual analogy. So to the unfortunate, ducks who are force-fed like this, then it's a human who's oppressing them, and we're trying to portray that by showing another familiar oppression, in fact. And as a communications person, I have to say that that's, scientifically speaking, that actually works. You get people to understand. So I just wanted to make that point. It's not great, but yeah. I'm interested in what people think.
So you think the third question, you think it is effective, and therefore we could use this kind of forms of tactics because it is so effective?
Yes, it's not without its dangers and its potential ramifications for some people, many people, but yeah, I think it is effective. Yeah.
All right.
Anna?
So I was also there, and like I didn't know that this action would happen, and as soon as I saw it, it made me feel very uncomfortable because the sounds were like, she was like screaming, and it just felt very sexualized. I just felt like the audience might not understand that it's about animals. Especially because there's no picture of a duck or things that indicate that it is about animals, and the sounds just overpowered it, and I felt very uncomfortable. And so I think there should be also more communication, that people know if there's going to be enactment, and yeah, some trigger warnings if people choose to do this, they think that's effective. Yeah, that's what I think.
If I understood correctly, Eve was going to say something, but it was, I guess, covered. If there's no other comment, then Glenn?
Yeah, I just want to give a little view of we as animal resistance itself. After doing, we discussed this action with, how many people are on the picture? 12 plus organizers. And unfortunately, nobody came up with a point up front, because I think we would have changed it if somebody would have made a comment, because honestly, we didn't think about that it would look like sexual assault or against sexism, because our organization is really against promoting that. We also deleted all pictures from our social media from this. Unfortunately, the action took place, media took pictures, so there's still pictures going around online. Like if you Google it, you can still find pictures. But yeah, it's definitely something where we need to be a lot more aware of next time, and it's definitely been a wake-up call. We also had a big discussion with the group about it afterwards, and we apologized to those who felt uncomfortable while the protest was happening. And I think it's definitely been I think optics, it can go better, and we'll definitely work on that in the future. And it's been, I think, one of the biggest lessons we had so far, I think.
That's actually a great response, Glenn. I'm very glad that animal resistance is, taking it so serious and really listening to people within the group that have this critique. And it's very, very okay also that you choose an action and you're not aware of that it potentially might be triggering or sexist, whatever, because that happens all the time. That happens to everyone. So there's absolutely no problem. I mean, well, there's a problem, but that's not really, I think it becomes problematic if you would not have listened to people and continued with this kind of action. So this is good. It's like you're learning. So yeah. Anyone else?
Gemma says, but is it because it's potentially perceivable as sexual assault? Or if there are other types of street theater that we would avoid, like people being in cages, because some humans are actually caged in different contexts?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a clear boundary of what you can and what you cannot do. But I would say, and actually that's also what I want to discuss the next slide, definitely before you develop any kind of action or tactic, you can check whether it is potentially sexist, for example. And if you don't know if it is sexist, then check with people who might be offended by it. So just create an awareness for it and just be careful. For me, it's also about kind of replicating oppressions. So that is one thing. On the other hand, there could be clear triggering of people. But that's also what we discussed a few days ago. It's just like also shouting in a busy supermarket might be a huge trigger for people. So that's another thing we could think about more. So yeah, I don't have a clear answer of like, oh, you should never put people in cages, or you should never do this or never do this, but just generally be aware of it. And if there's other ways of doing an action that are equally effective, I would always choose for those other ways.
Eve? Or Evie?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Ah, okay. It's the first time for me to use this. Sorry. Okay, I just wanted to add one point, because actually often we would not realize the effect until the minute we have put on the show. You know, everybody has all the equipment on and the whole set is ready, and then you realize, it actually has some different kind of effects. So I think the best thing to make sure of that is to really rehearse and to get opinions maybe from, from everybody within the group. That's just my thinking, because we had similar kind of situation here also. That's it.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, thank you.
Gemma also says, I think there is example for everything. I think that was her last comment. And I wanted to add, I personally think it's very sad that the pictures were taken down. I think it's a very good discussion and it should be talked about. I do not personally see a reason for removing the pictures. I mean, I also see a pair of Nike shoes in this photo, and I do not think that this is reason to remove a picture. It's reason for discussion. And I think also the intent and also the perceptions are important. So if I look at this, I will assume that there is a human with a vagina and there is a human holding the face, I'm assuming has a penis, and according to the genitals, I'm making this generalization of that this is a sexist act. Yeah, just my 2 cents for it. I want to add, I have to leave in 1 minute because I have a different meeting. So I'm already going to say goodbye and thank you for everyone. And after a few minutes, I'm just going to leave the meeting.
All right. Thank you so much. Yeah. I propose, we're already actually quite late. So this was kind of a summary of some ways how I think you can be inclusive as an organization, as a person. So first thing is have a kind of a red flag in your organization. So don't perpetuate any racism, any sexism, or any of the other isms. So yeah, check images, whatever. And this is something that you will learn over time and you have to check, but we discussed it. Another point is to make your meetings, your actions, whatever, to make it accessible to people, and especially people who are marginalized and people with disabilities, for example. So remove barriers for them. But it can also mean that, for example, if you have speakers, that these speakers are representative of the global population. Create a safe space, so have anti-discrimination statements and policies in place and really live up to that. Next level would be to build an anti-oppression culture, so really work on the deeper culture of the organizations, do trainings on issues like white privilege, and also to really act in solidarity with other justice movements. And this is actually also something that Brenda Sanders goes into in her speech. So really work with other movements and support them without hijacking their cause. So without going there and taking it over and coming with the vegan agenda. So really from a perspective of mutual learning and sharing. So this list is definitely not complete. So I put this stamp there, but it's just some few points that I think we could use. We lost our co-host. Maybe Glenn, can you check the chat for me? If there's any response. Because if not, it's also great.
Yeah. It's okay. I'll check this out.
Okay. So what I wanted to do in the last point, and I'm sorry that I'm running a bit over or out of the time, is to get into breakout groups, so small groups, and discuss what can or should be improved in our organizations to be more inclusive. And there's 4 topics that or 4 issues that we can focus on. One is on animal resistance, like we discussed the example of the action last year, so we can discuss on how to prevent this or how to work with these topics. Also the university itself, so is the university inclusive enough? Should it be more inclusive, and then how? If you want, you can also discuss any other group that you ally with or as an individual. Now, group number 1 was about animal resistance. Do you want to say something about what you came up with?
I didn't get that message.
Oh,
that it was specifically about animal resistance?
No, I made a message. Oh, that it was about, yeah, so group 1 was supposed to talk about animal resistance as an organization, but if the group didn't get it, it's okay.
Yeah, we didn't get that. I didn't get at that, but we did think of a few things. I mean, I can say them anyway.
Yeah, yes.
Well, there were mainly 3 points which we discussed, which was, first of all, in the workshops and these meetings and everything, we thought that was really interesting, asking for people's pronouns in the beginning so that people will feel accepted and that other people want to treat them correctly. Also, we mentioned the being open about anti-discrimination and mentioning that it is a safe space so that people will feel safe during workshops or actions or whatever it is. And also the fact that it's very interesting and important to validate people's identities. So asking people what they identify with, whatever it is, in whatever aspect of their lives, and validating that so that they feel like they are validated and important and that they are okay. So that's the 3 main points we thought about.
Cool, thank you. Then group number 2 was about the Animal Resistance University. Who wants to say something about that?
Does Beam or Gemma want to say something, or should I go?
Go ahead, Glenn, no problem.
Yeah, so we talked about Animal Resistance University. I'm one of the organizers of it, so I already have a little background. Behind the scenes, we were already talking about this, like how can we make it more inclusive. So we are already, I think one of them, if we look at, we have a lot of women speaking, especially if you compare women men, it's more women. So I think on that base we are okay. We also have several people from the LGBTQ community speaking, but one of the things which is really lacking is people of color. We have no one scheduled, and we had no one yet who is of color. So we are actively looking into, for example, we're looking into a talk on white veganism, and we first had a white person in mind, but we are going to try to find someone of color to do that. Oh yeah, I just see Ma that. You can consider him as as someone of color.
Exactly.
Right. So we do have someone. yeah, it's always like, what is actually someone of color, right? And I think I was more speaking of someone who appears as black. Is that discriminative to say black? I don't know. Yeah, and we were also talking about ableism. Like, I got a message of someone. Well, I got a message that someone messaged someone, a person who was deaf and who wanted to actually join the workshops. It's very difficult to have someone doing sign language. I think subtitles are impossible for Zoom. It's very hard to always have someone who does sign language. So I reached out and said that that person should let me know when they would join, and then I would try to find someone who could do sign language, because it always depends on availability and who can do sign language as well. And did we discuss something else? I have the feeling I forgot something.
We did talk about Indigenous, the intersection between Indigenous activists or activism within Indigenous communities and animal rights, yeah. And socioeconomic status, that was the last one.
Yes, and one of the things we also came up is having a talk about ableism. For example, we know Geertra, who is a little specialized on that, so it might be good to ask her if she's willing to give a talk as well about that.
Great, thank you. There's also a comment from Beam that there is an accessibility section in Zoom, so that's something that we can actually look into, Glenn, apparently. So group number 3 was on any kind of other organization that you want to discuss. So maybe someone from that group.
Yeah, we didn't get that message, but that's exactly what we talked about, so that's fine.
Nice.
Nella brought a very interesting point that now in Greece, or the group, I think your pronouns were she, I'm sorry if I'm misgendering you, that she doesn't take things for granted. So she doesn't say that everyone is aware about the other kinds of discrimination. So always make sure that the people you are working with just assume that they don't know anything about intersectionality and they don't know anything about other kinds of oppression, and that you always make sure to make them aware of that, which brought us to the point to maybe for the new joiners make a kind of a training about intersectionality and about discrimination in general, so people that are not aware of other kinds of discrimination, they get to know it either through workshops or online trainings. And also, yeah, while doing the debriefing, always make sure that people feel comfortable, make people say it clearly that you don't allow any other kind of oppression, and if someone doesn't feel comfortable, they should talk to you or talk to someone in the group that can talk to you, because you shouldn't assume that everyone feels comfortable talking to you. And I think, oh yeah, the other main topic we discussed was language, because our languages, so Greek and Arabic, they are not really gender friendly. So whether we should always speak in English or try to be more inclusive when we use our respective languages. Yeah, that was it. I don't know if you want to talk about languages, but yeah, that's it.
Thank you very much, Malek. And maybe the last group that was supposed to talk about individually what you can do for yourself, but whatever you want to report back is fine with me.
Yeah, we didn't get that it was specific for groups. But yeah, we talked in general what we could do as a movement to be inclusive. And one of the points was that often people are not aware if the event is accessible. For example, if you can come with a wheelchair, or sometimes marches don't have a sign language translator. So it'd be great to always have a section on accessibility to let people know. We talked as well on the representation in the movement and how it's
a lot of leaders are cis, male, and white, and how it's important to empower people of other identities, and not just as a token, but really give them leadership positions and roles, and yeah, and share more resources within the movement and help each other.
Cool, thank you very much. Glenn, you had an
Yes, I wanted to, because I forgot to say something. We ended on that note. We didn't really came with a solution. It seems kind of impossible. How to be inclusive towards people who, with like the university, for people who don't have a lot of money, for example, who cannot, who do not have like internet or like a laptop. Yeah, like we talked about it very briefly because it was in the very last seconds, but
yeah,
personally myself, I cannot think about, especially not with the situation. You cannot also like do like a screening somewhere or something where people can join. It is for free to join all workshops, so that's already a thing, but I think it's very difficult if you do online meetings to be inclusive towards those who cannot afford.
Yeah. Yeah, as a response to that, I don't also want to continue this specific workshop for too long, because we are, you know, like already 15 minutes over time. And I want to give people the opportunity to leave also and do their other things, including for myself. I think maybe it's an idea for Animal Resistance University to think about this topic a little bit more, and maybe also animal resistance, but just for the university, because that's something that is, you know, like going on now, and really do a little bit more of this kind of using this intersectional lens to check like who is currently, you know, like not really accessing the university, who is not speaking, why is that, what can we do? I would be very interested to be in such a group or whatever, but not discuss it so much anymore here. I see Glenn is doing this, so so actually what I wanted to do is, if there's anything urgent or a question or something you think, oh, I really need to say this, please put an X or say it now. Yeah, Malek gives a proposal for the accessibility, so that's great, we can keep that. Is there anyone else? All right, so then I would like to close this meeting, and maybe what we can do is on the university Facebook page, then post something about a group that works on inclusion, and you're all, I think, welcome to join that group. And also, yeah, continue this kind of workshops and meetings. All right, then, thank you all very much, and that was lovely to be with you, and have a great evening.
Yeah, I also want to thank you, Elz, for doing this, for facilitating this workshop. I think it's a really important topic, and it's something which should be more discussed, especially in the animal, well, in every movement, I think.
Yeah.
Well, every movement, every business, everywhere, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, thank you so much for facilitating this. We will be having another talk of Aisha Dani's Friday, Saturday, I think.
Yeah, next weekend, yeah.
So welcome to join there, and we'll like talk later about when the next discussion will take place, and please invite all your friends to it, because it's really important that everybody joins this.